Hi there, it's Dr. Marcus Bussey here. I am the course coordinator for History 140, History of Global Citizenship. I've been doing this for many years. 2007 was the first time that this course ran, and it was a lot of fun. And every year it's evolved a little bit in different ways. Went through some major dramatic changes with the COVID period, of course. But it's just a great course to teach, and I find that most students, after getting over the "oh my God, what's this all about" sort of phase, they come to love it. And many have told me in later years that they look back on this course as something that shifted their thinking about history. And it's quite simply that shift occurs because this is a course that doesn't do the standard history version of these dates, these famous people, these battles, these political decisions, and blah, blah, blah. It's looking at the very big picture of history. This is called cultural evolution, which sits nicely within what you might call cosmic evolution. So let me walk you through some of the principles that are in my thinking behind the course. And of course, this is an invitation for you to get curious. It's an invitation for you to work with ideas and thoughts and feelings about history, as opposed to what you would call the content, the data of history. I mean, there's data everywhere. I'm going to start off in a moment with the formal lecture with one example of the kind of data that just delights me, and I never cease to be thrilled when coming across new little pieces of the historical puzzle, you might say. So let's begin. So I'll just go to share screen. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. I'll make that bigger, and here we are. So History 140. I am looking at this thinking, why is it showing this way as opposed to the normal way? You don't want to see all this blur on the side, it will be distracting. So let me see if I can simply go toggle subtitles. No, if I can. Oh, I know what's going on. It's over here. And I can see, so you're not seeing what I'm seeing something else. All right, good. So I'll stop mucking about and confusing you and confusing myself. So here we are. We've got this wonderful image here. It's a photograph that I took myself. I seem to spend more and more time in Sweden doing Swedish things with Swedish students and Swedish researchers. And this photo I took probably around 2008, 2009. When I was in Sweden, in the sort of, you could call it the outback, not that Sweden has outback like we do, but certainly they have more remote areas. And this is on the Swedish-Norwegian border. And some friends of mine had taken me to look at these amazing stone carvings from the Bronze Age, particularly some from the Iron Age, by pre-Viking, what you would call Iron Age, Bronze Age, even Neolithic peoples living in the areas that were then fjords and are now rolling fields. And they had carved many, many thousands of what they call glyphs or petroglyphs, carvings in rock. And I found this one hidden behind a bush and stuff. Many of them get painted in by restoration archaeologists, so that visitors can come and marvel at the incredible creativity and the diversity of images. Wonderful animals, hunting scenes. This one struck me as quite unique. It was hidden behind some, as I said, some bushes. You can even see little bits of the shadow on the rock still. It hadn't been painted in, and it reminded me at the time of a falling figure, a bit like Icarus from the Greek myths. And it really, really thrilled me to find this all on my own. And I photographed it, and I've thought a lot about it over time, but read much more now on these petroglyphs. I realize it is probably an acrobat, that's the word, probably an acrobat, and doing a somersault on like that. Nonetheless, it's the thing that brings history alive. And history coming alive is something that this next is all about as well. So let's move to that. So here we have an expression of what I have a history love affair. I've had a history love affair since I was 8 or 9 years old. When I first started reading my history books and so on. I am a self-confessed nerd. So you'll have to put up with my nerdishness. But this I came across today, actually. And, you know, I thought, oh, that's a perfect way to start a course on history, where much of what we do focus on is the big picture stuff. But each week I aim to give you, you know, something that I would call, you know, historical general knowledge or historical data, some interesting little story, mostly from my great pile of National Geographic history books, not books, magazines, and they will start appearing for you as of week 2. But here we have this piece of pottery. It's a pottery shard, okay? A shard is just a broken bit of pot. It was dug up in Andalusia, which is in central Spain. And it was where the Romans, 2,000 years ago, had a major industrial complex that were manufacturing terracotta pots for oil, okay? So and they manufactured thousands and thousands and thousands of these over many centuries. What's interesting about this piece of pottery, this little broken piece of pottery, it measures 6 by 8 centimeters, okay, is that somebody had written with a stylus into the pot, into the base of the pot, so no one can see it. They call it graffito. And it wasn't just, you know, a shopping list. It wasn't just, you know, I love mum or something like that. This was really quite remarkable. Somebody had actually written a few lines from the poet Virgil. Virgil was a 1st century BCE poet who wrote the Aeneid, a story about the creation of Rome as refugees from Troy, and he also wrote a poem called the Georgics, which is where these lines come from. They were written from memory by, you know, a reasonably well-educated person. And this is what Charlotte Hickens, who's reporting for The Guardian, has to say on this. And with many of my images, note that if you put your toggle over the actual PowerPoint, you will find that that it takes you to whatever it is that I'm talking about. And that's the case with this one. So you can go to the full Guardian article and read about the whole thing in further detail. But I think this is beautiful. So she's quoting one of the archaeologists, and she says, who said this? The graffito was not part of the manufacturing or marketing process. It wouldn't have sold the amphora or said what was inside. When the pot was turned over, she goes, and filled with oil, it wouldn't even have been visible. But maybe we don't need to think about the whys of this. Maybe we only need to think of it being done. In that fleeting moment of clarity, I can imagine, that's the writer, can imagine a young man holding his breath in concentration, his left hand steadying the bulk of the weight of the pot, right? In his right hand, this metal tip of his stylus meets the sticky wrist of half-dried clay, and his memory is obedient, well, mostly, to the beat of Virgil's immortal lines. So what we're finding here is that an artifact, something that has emerged from the ground, takes us for a moment into another world, into another time, another space. And that's one of the beauties of history. It actually speaks to our imagination. And it's what keeps me eternally curious in that historical sense. So for me then, I'm inviting you in History 140 to find little pieces like this and join them together in the big picture of what it means to try and chart the history of global citizenship. A citizen is a member of a community, right? A citizen is a member of a city, state usually, or in our current situation, a nation state. But to me, citizenship is also about belonging to the broader community of humanity. And if you want to stretch it, and I like stretching things all the time, it's also about recognizing that we are parts of other communities, the non-human communities, the communities of nature, the communities of the rocks and the movement of the stars and the planet, community of microbes, communities of memories, communities that are not just in one time, but reach across to that young person who wrote those lines, presumably a man, because Rome was very, very much a patriarchal society, and women generally weren't allowed out of the house unaccompanied. So Charlotte here is quite right in suggesting that it was probably a young man who wrote this, but maybe he was trying to memorize the lines and he just scratched them onto the first thing he could at a moment when he had a moment's pause in a busy day. It's unlikely that it was scribed by a slave, because most slaves working at this time in these sorts of industries were slaves who were not literate. So who was it? Well, we'll never know. But their action has now reached across nearly 2,000 years. They've dated the shard to roughly, the 2nd century of our common era, so 1800 years then. And the rest can be mystery. And the mystery is what one of you guys might go and write a novel about. And in that novel, you can, I'm thinking of Lindsay Davis or someone like that, who's a great novelist for the Roman period. You can come up with an element of the story where this particular piece of shard gets written. Wouldn't that be cool? But now let's get back to what we're really doing here. I'm going to move on to talk about global citizenship. All right. So for me, as I already said, I've given you a little insight into how I see global citizenship. It's personal. It's my sense of belonging to a place. That means it's local, but it can also be tribal or familial. My family is who I am, or it can be the nation state. If you're a great nationalist with an Australian flag or whatever flag is your flag out the front there on the porch, it can be that sort of thing at a local level, but it can also be cultural. I'm a member of an educated group of historians, the historical community. I'm a historical citizen. Why? Because I have achieved a certain level of historical understanding that buys me entry to that world. Just like you can be a citizen of a football club, you could say. Of course, I'm stretching it again. Really, you're a member of a football club, you're a member of a historical community. But I'm thinking, well, how do we belong? This idea of citizenship is central to human thinking today about how do I belong, okay? I've already touched on the environmental citizenship and the temporal and even the cosmic. What we have here then is a way of thinking about, a term that helps us think about what does it mean to be a good ancestor. And that's really key for me. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? And I draw for that on a great book. I'm looking around my very messy desk. It's hidden somewhere. The book by Roman Krishnarik called The Good Ancestor. This here is a clip. Bing. Yep, see that? It's a clip that will take you to a 2-minute snapshot of Krishnarik talking about his book and the basic concept of the good ancestor. To me, then, education should enable us. So you're going to learn about a historical approach that should enable you to think a bit more clearly about what does it mean to be a global citizen in a time of great change and uncertainty, a time when people are arguing to and fro about climate change or whatever it might be, The Voice, for instance, and there's so much at stake for the future, for the kind of future that we're going to bequeath to our great-great-grandchildren and to all those microbes, animals, plants, and the atmosphere itself that is going to still be there, of course, in a few centuries' time, or not. We might all go extinct. That'd be cool. All right, so I want to suggest that thinking is collective. So one of the things that I've done in this course then is interview really interesting people that I meet along the way. Luckily, I get to sort of travel around and connect with people all over the place. And this particular clip here, and it's alive too, I'm just going to check to make sure, no, it isn't, but you've got it straight on the Canvas page anyway, is interview number 1 with Livia Filotico, She's a wonderful young woman who's been working in England, then went to Italy where I interviewed her, and now she's ducked off to Canada for a few years to do her PhD. She's a fascinating person, well worth listening to. Great to start off this series of lectures and study weeks, I guess you call them, for a discussion with her about what does she think global citizenship means. Okay, and that's the question for each one of these, and there are they run for the entire length of our course. So there's one a week. They're about 15 minutes. The longest one is week 2, actually, next week, where we lost track of time and ended up yakking for nearly 30 minutes, was it? Okay, but normally they're about 15 minutes. I try to keep them bite-sized so that you don't sort of fall off the perch going sort of, oh God, this stuff never stops. But you must remember that history is an ongoing process and it does never stop. Okay, we're part of it, and you can be looking all day, every day, 24/7, looking at the world around us through a historical lens. That means reading, video clips, news clips. That clip that I showed you before comes from Twitter. We've got another Twitter clip coming up as well. Here we go. So what can we say? Take a deep breath. History is all about context. World History in Context is the name of your reading for this week from David Christian, who is you could say, the intellectual architect for much of what we're covering in this course. What I want you to know, first off, making sense of the human experience across scales, from the intimate, that's the small, the family, the local, the personal, the you, the subjective, subconscious, all the way through to the cosmic, okay? And each one of those contexts, plural, has its own logic, its own fabric, you could say, of how do we see the world. And we've got to be able to move up and down through those scales of context, one of which is the temporal context, another is the spatial context. These are touched on by David Christian. And then there's the question for our first assessment task, which is context of complexity. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but we're mostly going to talk about it next week, of course. Okay, let's keep moving then. So here we have timelines and cities. I love this because what we and I'm not going to click on it because it's another 2 or 3 minute job like the little clip from Roman Krishnarik on good ancestorship, but it walks you through a visual representation of the way cities emerged across time. From the first cities about 3,300 years before the Common Era, right through to now. So, and you can see that even looking at this image, you can see those little dots that everything started in the Central Asian strip there. What you would call West Asia, what we used to call the Middle East particularly, okay? And it just takes you on a walk across time. Timelines are really useful for visualizing things. I always flag a warning that timelines are also seductive because they tend to help us, or no, encourage us, not help us, encourage us to think in linear terms when really so much is going on around each one of those little dots that appears on this timeline that we can forget that and get sort of caught up on linear progression. Okay, but having warned you about that, let's just keep moving. So that means that some of what you are going to experience here is going to be counterintuitive to your experience of history. Linear history is the way much of your historical educations have probably occurred. I want to turn now to one of my favorites, is Carl Sagan. This is a Twitter clip that I took as well, that I'm sharing with you. I'm suggesting that we need to unlearn things. Now, Carl Sagan, if you don't know him, he was the guy who came up with the Cosmos series in the late 1980s, but mainly in the 1990s before he died, very unfortunately, of cancer in his early 50s or something like that. But he was an incredible visionary, and he had this to say: you go talk to kindergartners or first grade kids, and you find a class full of science enthusiasts. They ask deep questions. They ask, what's a dream? Why do we have toes? Why is the moon round? What is the birthday of the world? Why is grass green? These are, in Sagan's mind, profound questions. They just bubble right out of them. But then you go and talk to a group of 12th graders, and there's none of that. They become incurious. Something terrible has happened between kindergarten and 12th grade. Yeah, something terrible has happened, right? And it's called education. Yeah, I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to it, simply because we do it quite badly in some respects in our current world. We educate for answers. So for me, and this is my comment now, the study of the humanities calls us to reignite our curiosity. That's the humanities. That's history, sociology, philosophy, anthropology, geography, those things, okay? Literature and English and languages. They ignite hopefully they can reignite our curiosity, which has been dampened by formal studies based on correct answers. Live, I say, for the questions. And here I turn to a great guy, John O'Donoghue, who also had to cheat to go and die in his early 50s, like Carl Sagan. O'Donoghue points this out, that possibilities are always more interesting than facts. You could substitute questions are always more interesting than answers, okay? Facts are retarded possibilities. Answers are retarded questions. They were possibilities, you could say, that have already been actualized or answered. I think that's a really, really interesting way of thinking about this. So one of the things that we're going to try and do in this course, and of course, my two noble tutors are going to help me with this, and I should have introduced them earlier. That's Gil Douglas and Caitlin Noakes. Okay, we all together are going to work with you to do some unlearning about how to think historically, not in linear terms and not in terms of answers, but in terms of thinking with ideas, okay? So don't get too scared, but get excited, get curious. What on earth's he talking about, you say? Questions, not answers. Well, that's what I'm talking about. So what do I have to say here? There is an interesting tension between these two things. Questions open things up. Answers close things down. So where do we go from that? Well, if answers are closing things down, we don't want them too often. I might say to you, in what year did Captain Cook come and claim Australia for the British Crown? And you might say 1770. And I'd say, well done. Here's a koala stamp for being such a good answer, or here's a Mars bar. Oh, that's the way to go. So, but those kinds of answers just kill the thing. Well, so what? So we came here in 1770. Took another 18 years, didn't it, for the white guys to come back and start really messing around with that continent. So what can I say then? One last point about education per se. This comes from a really great article called Developing Self-Authorship. In other words, how to think for yourself as opposed to think as you've been programmed to think through mainstream education. And also I have to say, the superficial representation of history that you get from the History Channel and other places, other sources like that. So I argue that reason is contextual. What makes sense or is rational to an Aboriginal person, especially one in the 1788, let's say, would be irrational to those Western white English colonists who came here at that time, and of course vice versa. Okay, so rationality is something that is a moving feast. And that's what I say in my own little YouTube clip here. The things in blue, for those of you who don't know PowerPoint very well, when you download my PowerPoint, you can click on them and you can go on adventures. So many students enter college believing that there is a single right answer authorities should tell them. I'm not going to tell you any answers. Well, I just gave you the Captain Cook one, but that's not really an answer, is it? These students see the world in binaries of right or wrong, good or bad. Is that you, or can you already get rid of binaries from your head? As students progress through their college, that's through your degrees, their ways of knowing become increasingly more relativistic. That means Could be not. Grey everywhere. Maybe not. Constructed, let's see, and you're building a world out of various elements, okay? And contextual, that's what I'm talking about, right? They move away from thinking there is always a single right answer, and begin to see that, and underlined in bold, determining what is right requires analysis of relevant evidence. That's what history is all about, the relevant evidence in the light of the context in which that evidence appears. Go back to the shard that I started this with, that Roman piece of Roman pottery with this little bit of Virgilian poetry on it. What's the context? How come we can think that it was probably a young man or a man that wrote those lines, not a woman? I gave you the answer, inverted commas. I gave you a response, that there is what we know of Roman culture, and we know quite a lot about Roman culture. We know that it was highly patriarchal, that it would be very unlikely for a woman on her own, particularly a woman who was literate and well-educated, to be out and scribbling down a piece of poetry on the underside of a pot in a marketplace or an industrial context where there were hundreds of these pots lying around, drying in the beautiful Spanish summer sun. All right? So keeping moving. So what do I want you to do for this week? Go and listen to this lecture. Well, obviously, if you've got up to this point, you are doing that. I really need you, please devote some time to the David Christian article, World History and Context. I'm going to post a clip that in the week 2 readings where I actually unpack that reading for you. You can always jump ahead to week 2 and have a listen to that as well if you've got lots of time in your hand. All right. I've given you a very short reading also from Brené Brown, a couple of pages, in which she talks about curiosity as an emotion, as something that emerges from the way we see the world and experience the world. It's beautiful, and as I say, it's short. It's there simply because I really want to emphasize that curiosity should be a key driver in our work, always in history and dealing with the past. Then have a listen to that interview with Livia on what makes a global citizen. All right. And to help with this week's reading, have a look at that clip from David Christian, 10 to 15 years old now, but it's a terrific clip where it's a TED talk, and he tells us the history of the world in 18 minutes. So that's my shopping list for this week. If you can get through all of that, you can be proud. And of course, maybe some of you will listen to this in O week, which will give you an extra week up your sleeve to work your way through that. You've got to give yourself time, and you've got to be able to devote time to these readings and to the thinking. Otherwise, you'll only be going skin deep type thing, and that won't help you with some of the key concepts in this course. So moving on, the past's a foreign country. They do things differently there. That means that there's so much about the past that we are not going to be able to really access. There are elements of the past that will remain elusive. And we have to therefore understand that the past, as we work with it as historians, is about helping us reflect on the human condition and on who we are now. I've got to talk about that word context again. Okay, so what are we doing in this course? Our course seeks to make sense of humanity over time in relation to the whole. So what's that whole? It's the cosmos. Cosmos has been expanding since the Big Bang, okay? It expands. As it expands, it changes, goes through different stages. What David Christian and other big historians like to call thresholds. We'll talk more about those in a later week. Each stage requires a unique, each stage is a unique physical expression, and it incorporates what came before. So each stage is getting more complex. Let's have a look at how this is understood. David Christian was greatly influenced, or has been greatly influenced, he's still alive, thankfully, by the work of Eric Chaisson, who describes the world as a series of epochs, these cosmic epochs, and they get represented in this. You're going to see a number of these over the next few weeks as we dive into the course and go deeper in the course. Eric Chaisson is a man that I recommend you go and have a read of. His book, Cosmic Evolution, is or was in the library. It should still be there. Yeah, the Big Bang, we go through the radiation era, then we get to the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, we love that term. What does it even mean? Then we get stars forming, then we get a period where galaxies are forming, and then we get, reasonably recently, the sun and the earth and the stars, have formed. And we've been around, this planet has been around, according to astrophysicists, had to think of the name, for 4.5 or so billion years, something like that. So Big History then is about seeing all this stuff in context. Check out the Big History website link here. It's a good site. If you want to understand the story, let's say, I'm giving you an example now of the pyramids of Egypt, you need to look at the environment of Egypt. What was happening in the lead up to these pyramids? Well, there was a period about 11,500 years ago when the Sahara was not a desert. It was a green grassland. It had hippos and giraffes and all sorts of mammals and birds and lovely watery areas. But then very suddenly and quite rapidly, over about 2,000 years, it dried out. There was a slight shift in the Earth's axis, okay? And that led people, they were forced, human beings who were enjoying that lovely green environment, north or south. So some went into sub-Saharan Africa, and others went north to the river Nile and settled down there. And traditions, or religious traditions and beliefs and so on from that green period of the Sahara were transported with them. The cattle cult, okay, mummification, okay. The first ever to be found was that of a young child in the Green Sahara, okay. So really interesting. But context, okay? So if it's a story of energy, there's the Green Sahara, people are there with animals, they're all enjoying, okay? There are lots of resources. And then there's this period of complexity when people have to shift and adapt and evolve and move, just like we're going to have to do over the next couple of centuries as climate change impacts our cultures more and more. Okay. It is also a story of collective learning. One of the key, other key ideas. So we've got energy, complexity, and collective learning. They're the three ideas. I'm going to highlight them again in a moment, just to sort of drum it in. Okay, and where are we now? Well, we're in a period some people like to call the Anthropocene. That's a link too, okay, the Anthropocene. What does it mean? Well, it means that we're going to go through a period of intense pressure, where the drivers of ecological change, environment, and not just ecological, but atmospheric change, changes in the hydrosphere, are all going to impact on human cultural processes and all our friends, our bigger, broader naturally, without whom, we will certainly go extinct. But and we're all going to have to evolve in ways, our social ways, then we're not going to grow gills or feathers or anything else, but we're going to have to evolve culturally. We're going to have to evolve economically. We're going to have to evolve, hopefully, more inclusive, more equitable political systems, for instance. We're going to have to rethink a lot of what it has meant to be human over the last 2 to 3 centuries. Okay, so this is going to happen, and it's going to happen really rapidly. The Anthropocene is one way of thinking about that. Okay, so we've got contested histories. I just want to talk about this for a minute, using DNA, all right? The latest study of genetic history of India illustrates that there's massive genetic diversity in that country. Now, I point to this because India is a country that at the moment that's trying to go through an essentialization process where there are Hindus and there is everybody else, okay? It's a right-wing political movement led by the central government in order to establish a very solid political base for that government, because the Hindus are the majority people, Islamic people, tribal peoples, Christians and so on the outer. And so if we look at, though, at genetic composition is way more genetically diverse than Europe. I want to flag that because it's really important to remember that diversity sits behind so much of what we are talking about in this world history course. So my approach then is to link the data, let's say like the genetic stuff from India, or the shard from Andalusia in Spain, which is from the Roman period. The data gives us information, which is, we take elements of that data to understand something about the historical and human context. When that starts to firm up, it ends up becoming some kind of story, a knowledge base that we can work from. When you're really able to swim in that water comfortably, okay, we have some level of what people like to call wisdom. All up, this is a form of historical literacy. You need data. We need to know about Virgil from ancient Rome. We need to know about the work of geneticists in India, Australia. A fascinating story about Indigenous Australian DNA. It's really good to go and find out where your DNA comes from. Okay, this is all important stuff, and it's all data that becomes information. Information is energy, complexity, and collective learning. When we can apply those understandings, it becomes knowledge. And then when we can apply them in sophisticated ways where we can find a place for everything without fudging it, without bending it to fit, oh, this is my worldview and I need it to work like that, that is what you might call wisdom. Okay, so David Christian notes, and this quote's been with me since I've been teaching the course. It's one of the few things that you could say is has continued all the way through. One of the aims of world history is to see the history of human beings as a single coherent story, rather than as a collection of the particular stories of different communities. You know, Gil and Caitlin and I, we could probably almost recite that off by heart, but it's well worth thinking that the aim of this type of history is to see the history of our species as a single coherent story. And that means we have to step back and see them in quite different ways. The three concepts that David Christian presents us with are these: energy, complexity, and collective learning. Really exciting concepts. Everything boils down to our whole technologies, and everything boiled down to the way we build our cities is about what kind of energy we have available to us. How do we manage that energy? What can we do about the complexity as we get more energy and as cities and human civilizations become more developed, complex, whatever? We have to deal with complexity. When we face issues like this Anthropocene that we've been talking about with climate change and everything, how do we collectively learn? How do we understand and come together to accept the role that colonization, colonialism, and violence has played in our global history? It's everywhere. You can't just say that white Australia has a monopoly on it. It's, you know, the whole of the, there's nowhere that we have not got violence in the past. We don't need it in the future necessarily, but can we collectively learn our way out? That's a big question, isn't it? So how do we make sense of all this? David Christian offers us the metaphor of maps, the maps of time. This is his great big thick book, which sits behind his article. And so if you want to go and explore it, if you really love this course, it's a book that you probably should buy, because it's really filled with rich data. And he kind of tells you the story that goes along. So it's a very descriptive book. Not a book of theory, in other words, really. But at the beginning, he talks about maps, and he says there are different kinds of maps, just like he does in the article that you're going to read for this week. And so maps to me are really interesting because they're sense-making tools. People have been making maps. They're, you know, long dots and things on rocks and bones carved, you know, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, are maps of the constellations, or maps of, you know, movements of bison or foods and so on, herds as being tracked by different peoples. So we've been map making, and even if you think of it slightly differently, if you can stretch your mind to think of this, think of stories as maps. So that means all the Dreamtime stories and the beautiful Indigenous art that we have in Australia, they are all maps. When the painters paint these beautiful Indigenous works that have become very popular over the last 30, 40, 50 years, they sing their stories while they're doing it, and they work on these things often collectively. They're not just an individual like a Pablo Picasso or Leonardo da Vinci doing a one-off. No, these are often very collective things as well. So there are myths and theories. These are maps. There are creation myths. There's science. That's another map. David Christian goes to great length to point that out in the introduction to that book. It's about finding meaning, making sense of things. The task of history then is to understand where we are today, the present, as a chance of set elements that are the result of constant experiment that has gone on before. You know, there's no reason why we should be here instead of over there. And that's one of the reasons why fiction can be so interesting, science fiction particularly, exploring alternative routes. John Toth, a really interesting historical theorist, says that history is a chronicle of alternatives. A book that I touch on sometimes in this course is called The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow. Okay, and in that they point this out. They point out that there have been so many different social experiments. The political world that we live in today is not a given. It is just one way of doing things, just like the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, the ancient Chinese, the ancient Indians, the ancient Indigenous Australians have all had different social processes which seemed permanent and never changing, everlasting. That's what I'm trying to say. These things just unfold and wrap us in a sense of the present that is stable, but really it's not stable, and things can change very rapidly. So he talks a lot about maps, does David Christian, of complexity, and your assessment one asks you to explore this concept. Complexity is a condition in which we as actors are only ever partially aware of what's going on. That's to be remembered, okay? This leads to an uncertainty, of course, and the desire to control things by simplifying the world around us into answers. Complexity recognizes that there are no answers. Oh no, there are no answers, only possibilities, and that our best intentions must guide us. Our best intentions, these intentions reflect our values. So if you're a person whose values are fear-driven, distrustful, pessimistic, you're going to want to build walls around everything and secure what we have, because the future is dark and uncertain, and you want to make sure that your grandkids at least have a better chance of living, and who cares about the rest, because you can't take responsibility for them. The alternative, of course, if you're optimistic and you have a deep commitment to social justice, environmental justice, you might want to totally rethink and reenact our political and economic systems. And of course, you need other people to do that with you. So these are collective actions as well. Mapping the history of evolution of humanity in the context of this evolution of our planet is one response to that condition. We need to have thinking tools to think ourselves through and into the future. It requires historical knowledge, a tolerance for uncertainty, and a desire to be a good ancestor, which takes me back to Roman Krishnarik's book, okay? You can also see my little article on mapping time via that link if this interests you. So here we have the thresholds, okay, the Earth's solar system, the Big Bang, these things. You look at that, it's alive and kicking, that one. But the thresholds in evolution are something that I'd like you to start thinking about, acquaint yourself with. All right, so I'm taking you on a massive journey in 42 minutes. Just want to sum up by saying, look, this is a course. My God, you've got assessments to do. The first couple of assessments are a snap, as we say. You know, we've got to make a simple Padlet type mind map. You don't have to use Padlet, but that's what we use as our mind mapping tool of choice. You could even draw it by hand if you like. In fact, yeah, that would be rather nice if you have an artistic temperament, and you just write 300 words about what does What do you see Christian meaning by these concept maps of complexity? Then you do an oral presentation, Pechikichu, which is a 7-minute presentation. We will train you in that, basically taking us on a quick whirlwind tour of some areas of history that you like and linking them obviously to the concepts of this course. And finally, you've got a written essay. Here is task 1 spelled out for you. I've just snipped this, as I did with the previous one, straight out of the course outline. The course outline is the Bible, guys. Go to it, rely on it, look at it. And if you have questions, you come to me, or if your tutors are Gil or Caitlin, them and you ask questions. This just lays out, that we've given you this statement from David Christian. It's quoted there, and you write a 300-word statement in response to that. And you do a little mind map to go with it. We will be walking you through that. We've got lots of resources to help you with that. I want to thank you for hanging in there with me. And I'm really looking forward to meeting some of you face to face. I can always meet in the lands of Zoom as well, though Caitlin is our Zoom jockey for this semester. Gil, he's down at Moreton Bay and doing some of the sessions up here at Sippy Downs as well. I say up here simply because I'm in on the Sunshine Coast up behind Mullaney. So that's where I like to hang out whenever I can. I want to thank you so much, and I'm going to stop share. Bing. And I'm going to say, see you later, guys, and I will catch you soon. Bye-bye.